Welcome back to TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought.
Hey, Cameron, how you doing, man?
Hey, Phil, how are you?
I'm good. It's been a while.
It has been a long time since we've done this. Yeah.
Yeah. So what you been reading lately?
Well, a lot actually, but I've been reading a book on the Septuagint. What is the Septuagint and why does it matter? So
yeah,
that's one of the things I've been reading. I've been reading some other books on the synoptic problem and Paul's use of Yahweh texts, that sort of thing. Yeah, I read a book on Nabonidus, king of Babylon. So
wow,
several things in the lineup, I suppose.
I've been reading Harry Potter and Solo Leveling. It's a good one.
Solo Leveling.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is.
It's a literary RPG.
Rocket propelled grenade.
Yes.
Okay.
So
about you I need to learn.
literary role playing game. So there's
okay.
leveling system, and
okay.
it's a good series.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, you've been busy, new job.
Oh yeah,
and
yeah.
So yeah.
And you'd think I would use my drive time, my commute, to be more productive, but no.
Well, you can't be productive all the time, otherwise.
I'd be like you.
Yeah, if only. Yeah, right. If only I were productive is what I meant. Yeah.
All right, so
but
Septuagint.
I've been reading about the Septuagint. Yeah, so kind of interesting. So learned a lot of stuff. So.
Okay, so it's called what? What is the Septuagint?
Yeah, let's see. What is it actually called? The Septuagint, what it is and why it matters. Gregory R. Lanier and William A. Ross. So, it's a great great introduction to Septuagint. So, first of all, do you know what the Septuagint is?
Well, it's a Greek translation.
Yep.
Of the Hebrew, what we would call the Old Testament.
Yeah, the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, what Christians call the Old Testament. That's right. So it's
something about 70.
Right, yeah. So it comes from a Latin word for 70 because there's a traditional story about the Septuagint being translated by 70 different individuals, and there's a miraculous element there. They all are separated and they translate it, and when they come together, wow, they translate it all the same way, right? That's the story, which of course is just a legend, but it's because of that it's called the Septuagint, which as I said in Latin means 70 because these 70 translators. You'll often see it abbreviated in text with the Roman numerals LXX, which means 70. So that's easier than typing out Septuagint every time. So you'll see LXX. So yeah, that's it. And one of the interesting things is that I learned is actually there's no such thing as a Septuagint. So.
Wait, what? Okay, you got to explain that one.
So they go to great lengths. Well, we talk about, and I've done this, we talk about the Septuagint.
Yes.
The thing is, there isn't a text that is recognized as the Septuagint. There's multiple texts, multiple translations of the Hebrew Bible into Greek.
Right.
And I should say that these translations, they all started occurring around the 3rd century BC, so the 200s, 100s BC. And so over that period of time, there were multiple translations, multiple attempts, multiple works, different people translating.
Was it 70?
It wasn't 70.
Oh.
No, we don't really know. And there are actually multiple time periods when it was translated. And just like, the rest of the Bible, people are probably familiar with the English translations of the Bible, right? There's all kinds of versions, translations, and they have different philosophies about how they're going to conduct the translations.
Yeah.
And we see the same thing with the Septuagint. Different periods of time, there are different ideas about how it should be translated. And so some of them are more word for word. At least it seems like the earliest versions of the Septuagint, so the Pentateuch, in other words, the first 5 books, the Law, the Torah, whatever you want to call it, was probably translated first, and that seems to have been initially translated very more word for word.
Okay.
So you get.
So I'm pretty familiar with this. So
right, okay.
I took so hermeneutics class a long time ago.
Okay.
But we had these word for word very literal translations.
An example in English would be the English Standard Version, which is very word for word. Yeah.
So the other would be dynamic equivalence.
Right.
And the example that I learned about, I can't remember exactly what country it was done, but is they find an unreached people group, they learn the language, they want to translate, they want to translate scripture for them in their own language. So this was in I think it was Ecuador, because it had to do something with the equator. I remember that. Because they were around the equator, wherever this was.
All right, okay.
So the unreached people group there, they were trying to say sins or the washed white as snow.
Oh yeah.
And they were trying to explain the concept of snow.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand it.
Yeah.
So as they're explaining snow and this purity thing, they're like, "Oh, you mean yucca?" And they're like, "What's yucca?" And yucca was this really, really white plant or root of a plant. So in the translation of the text, rather than say white as snow, they would say white as yucca.
Yeah.
So it's the same meaning,
right?
And the people understand it the same way. It's just a dynamic equivalence,
right?
But you're taking away that sort of word for word text, and then of course you have these translation philosophies. This gets really, really big deal because people look at, if you add or take away from the text, then your name will, be taken away from the book of life and stuff like that. So,
Yeah.
So it's a big deal.
Yeah. So you see that for example, it's called parataxis, which is, so in Hebrew, it's a very common thing to just show a transition from one thought to the next by just saying, and right, or and then, and so if you read one of these word for word translations in English, you'll see they'll start with and then and then and then and then, or and or then.
There's a really good movie. I can't remember what it's called. He goes up to order food from a McDonald's or something, and no, it's a Chinese restaurant. And the lady's so he orders the food, and he goes, he orders whatever he wants. She goes, and then,
yeah,
and he orders it, and then, and then they get back and forth, and it goes literally, and then, just like you just said.
Yeah, well, that's it. Well, so that is actually really common in Hebrew, right? That's a Hebrew style. It wasn't in Greek, but we see the earliest translations of the Pentateuch. Copy that pretty word for word, and so we get sort of that feeling in the earliest Greek translations, and then you get another thing is, so Hebrew, in ancient Hebrew they didn't have quotation marks, so no way to really set off and say this is a quotation, and so in Hebrew it will say something like "he said," saying. And then they'll say what he said. Well, then we see that in these earliest versions of the Pentateuch where it's translated literally into Greek, which is not a very Greek thing, but that happens. So early on, and then you'll get later verses seem to have been translated after the Pentateuch, and they were maybe more free translations, more dynamically equivalent and less word for word.
Okay.
And then there's a reaction to that. And so then there's more word for word translations. So I guess the point is that the Septuagint is really just a whole variety of translations and a variety of texts. Now, I think when most people talk about the Septuagint today, they mean probably they read, I have a copy of the Septuagint in my library, right?
Yeah.
And it's a modern sort of collection, edition, where they're, looking at maybe the best texts or combination of them. Or they're often sticking to one of the collections that happened early on, like there's a Codex Vaticanus and a Codex Alexandri, and so these texts are then. So when they talk about the Septuagint, that's often what they mean. but there are multiple translations in the Greek.
So when like the Dead Sea Scrolls, huge find, and I know that when one of the discoveries was that it was extremely similar to most of the writings are extremely similar to the Septuagint, correct?
Well, so with the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you have there are Hebrew translations of these books,
right?
That are ancient and go back, and that seems to have been a different sort of document, family tree, if you will, than
Wait,
a
was that
Septuagint.
the Masoretic text?
The Masoretic text is a Hebrew text. It's much later, right?
Yeah. Okay,
and that's
so
our Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, is based upon the Masoretic text,
right?
But that's a medieval document. I think it's like 10th century, so it's very late. And prior to that, the only other sort of version of the Old Testament we had was the Septuagint, and all of its different translations. Then the Dead Sea Scrolls are discovered in the 40s, and there we start getting other Hebrew texts that predate the Masoretic text. And I think what you're referring to is that we can see that in those Hebrew texts, they align very closely with the Masoretic text.
Gotcha.
So that gives us some security that there, it makes sense, because if you're talking about scripture here, and if you recognize it as scripture, you're going to try to be as faithful as possible, right? So, we see that there's not a lot of discrepancy between, copies we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls, for example, and then in the later Masoretic text. But the Septuagint is sort of outside of that stream, so it's another.
Yeah,
because it's a Greek translation from.
Well, and this,
earlier.
I think this is one of the big issues. I mean, Muslims, one of the entire arguments is that Scripture has changed over time; it's been corrupted, and and then Mormons, same thing.
Yeah.
And there's sort of a common understanding that the Bible's been changed over time, and I think that the evidence doesn't really line up with that view.
No, not really. No. So what you will see, like I say in the Septuagint and the different Greek translations, you'll see different philosophies about how to translate it.
Yep.
But essentially, now we don't know always if the different readings are just different ideas in translation, or if what we're dealing with is maybe a different textual tradition, right? So one translation, is it working from a different Hebrew text version than another, or are we just seeing theories about translation? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, but you can kind of tell.
So now, is that what this is talking about in the book here?
Well, some of it, yeah. So basically, they lay out how there are these different currents of translations, right? So early on, like I say, the Pentateuch is pretty word for word, and then there's a much more freer translations, and then there's a reaction to that almost at the same time, where we're going to give a more word for word translation. So we actually have kind of different translations of the same text often. So that's kind of what they lay out, and they emphasize over and over again that the Septuagint, there really is no such thing as the Septuagint.
Yeah.
There are multiple text traditions, multiple translations.
Well, that's actually news to me. I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, it was news to me too when I read it. So yeah, it was really interesting. And then of course the question is, well, who cares? Why does it matter?
Did you read the section on why it's important?
Well, I skimmed it because I was more familiar with those sorts of ideas, and so I didn't actually read it in detail because I was more. But the thing about it is the usefulness of the Septuagint. And here I just said it because there's no way real around it. Usefulness of these Greek translations is that they give us an understanding about how people interpreted the Hebrew Bible, the Old Testament, in the 1st, 2nd century BC, right? So because they're choosing Greek words, right, to represent the Hebrew, right? So there's a so for example, there's a good example. You know, when in Genesis it says the world was formless and void, right? Mm-hmm. And the Hebrew words for that are tohu wabohu, right? So, and there's some debate about exactly what those words mean, and if you look at the Greek translation, right, you see what Greek words were used to translate those, which escape me right now. I was trying to look real quick, but that gives us an idea of kind of what those words were thought to mean, right?
Yeah.
So that's where a lot of this, the Septuagint can be very useful. If we look at, now this is for another episode, but when we talk about Cape's Yahweh texts in the writings of Paul, so Paul, not to get off subject, but Paul uses the common usage of the time referring to God with the Greek word kurios, which means Lord. Mm-hmm. And so we can look at the Septuagint and see which is what he was using, right? What text was in those texts, what words were they translating as Lord, right? So it varied a lot. And then we can understand, maybe more deeper meaning from that.
Well, this is probably a good segue. Go ahead and, we're about out of time.
Yeah.
Talk about capes next time.
Yeah, I think that'd be good.
Yeah.
Interesting stuff. So
awesome.
Yeah, good.
It's good to see you again.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
Hopefully this will be more regular, so it'll be fun.
Definitely. All right, well.
Set up here. Thanks, Chesley. So
behind the cameras.
Yeah.
Thank you for watching TACTCast, a production of the Tennessee Academy of Christian Thought. Be sure to subscribe, like, and comment. Make sure to follow us over on our social medias. Links in the description. Thanks for watching.